Hello and welcome to the Alyosha Society, where we are pursuing truth and beauty and goodness through great literature. This video is intended primarily for teachers. Teachers, I want to talk about the literary toolbox, and I want to talk about one of the tools in particular in that literary toolbox, genre. And what I want to do is my insight after many years of teaching is this: students say they don't like to read books. They think they mean that, and they do believe they mean that, but they probably don't. They don't understand what they're reading. Once they begin to understand what they're reading, they will actually enjoy it a lot more. So that's why I have what I call the literary toolbox. We teach students how to reach into that toolbox and use the tools that are in it. They understand, they comprehend a lot more of what they're reading, and then they learn slowly to love it, to actually enjoy it. So let's get right to it. And we're off. So genre questions. Let me talk a little bit about how this is going to tie in specifically. I'm going to put myself way down here. Yeah, so it is a very important part of helping students understand what they're reading is learning that the genre of a particular work of literature matters. It matters that you know what that genre is. It matters that when you're reading it, you're keeping that in mind. So what I'm doing here in this video and on these slides is I'm giving you a list of some common genres, not by any wild stretch anything exhaustive, but some of the more common genres. And then along with questions that the student should be asking when they're reading any book of that genre. So when you walk through, I'm just going to give one example, we'll get right to it. Let's say an autobiography. You teach a student how to read an autobiography, and then they use those same questions, those same tools, those same skills anytime they're reading an autobiography in the future. It's all about giving them the skills, or what we call the tools of learning. So you see what I've said here, that we want to teach students how to understand that the genre of a work of literature has to be considered. Now, I put these in alphabetical order. These are the ones I'm dealing with here. Once again, I welcome your feedback, Bruce at alyoshasociety.com. If you've made up a bunch of your own, send them to me. I'm sharing mine with you. Feel free to share yours with me. These are just the ones that I have been teaching in the last few years. So they're the ones I'm going to be talking about. So let's briefly take a look. If you're not familiar with what I call the literary toolbox, these are the different areas that we teach a student how to use this tool for any book they're reading. We teach students how to understand the historical context. The biographical context is primarily talking about the author there. If the work of literature is focusing primarily on an individual, whether it's a real individual or a fictional individual, that could come into play, but that's biographical context. Literary devices, again, we're not doing these in this video, but these are some of the tools in the literary toolbox. And then we talk about the 5 elements of a standard plot, and we kind of teach students how to look for those and identify them. Once again, all 4 of these will enhance their understanding of what they're reading, and enhancement of understanding equals more enjoyment. So what we're doing in this video is genre questions. Genre questions. What are the standard set? These are generic questions on purpose, so they can take them and apply them to any and all works of that genre. So alphabetically, we're going to begin with allegory. So here are some questions. First of all, are you making it an allegory? How do you know it's an allegory? You need to be able to establish, did the author say it's an allegory? Is it obvious that it's an allegory? Why would the author have chosen an allegory as opposed to some other genre? So when you look at, for example, maybe Narnia or The Pilgrim's Progress, why did Bunyan, why did Lewis, why did the author do that? There's probably a reason for it. When you're looking at this work of literature as an allegory, how do you identify what each character represents on a deeper level? Ooh, boy, that's an important one. It's important to know if you're reading a Christian allegory or not. If you're reading an author that you know for sure was steeped in a Christian tradition, then when you see things that look like biblical allusions or references or whatever, then you can probably more safely assume that that's what it is. If the opposite is true, then you need to take that into consideration. That's a good thing to know. What is the author's worldview and how does it impact what the allegory is? You know, allegories can be tricky. You know, there are a number of works that we tend to look at as allegories. And yet, when you go back and hear what the author, him or herself, said about it, they may have said, "This is not an allegory. I wish people would stop calling it." Okay, so it's good to know that. Good to know the author's worldview. And what exactly is the message? What is the allegory meant to express? What is the author saying is a good thing? And what is about this? Just goes back to basic values and authority. Like, what is your authority for saying this is good or bad? These are general questions that are good to ask anytime you're reading an allegory. Next on the list, autobiography. Using Frederick Douglass. Why is the author writing? You know, some people think, how arrogant do you have to be to write an autobiography? Well, friends, that's not always the case. Many very humble individuals have written autobiographies for particular reasons, and it's good to know. It's good to know, okay, what's the motivation? Now, friends, listen, you also want to help students understand you might not be able to answer all these questions. There may be questions that aren't knowable, but you just want them to learn as much as they can in that particular genre. Now, this is a really big one, and this is one of the reasons I put Frederick Douglass up here as an example, because, you know, if an author is writing an autobiography, then what part of the story is untold? If I write an autobiography when I'm 30 and I live to be 80, then okay, what's going to happen with that 50 years? Does the author still believe the same things that he or she said, you know, if they made statements about broader issues or values? And you know, if an author is writing something later in life, that's important too, because we tend to forget things. You know, I'm 54 years old right now. I can barely remember some things that happened when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, but I'm pretty sure that my version of the stories has probably become skewed over the years. These are really good things to think about in an autobiography. Oh, this is a really good one. Can these events be confirmed? So if the autobiographer is talking about global events or events of a particular country, are they true? Can they be confirmed outside of the work that you're reading? I think this is an interesting one. You don't want it to skew students too much, but how was it? How did the critics, how did the original readers deal with it? You know, and see, that could go to the issue of hypocrisy. You know, if I write an autobiography and I'll make myself look amazing, I'm father of the year, husband of the year, you know, I'm this, blah, 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 blah. And the people around me react saying, what is this guy talking about? None of this stuff is true. Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. Yeah, and autobiographies can be very tricky, guys. I've read a number of them, and the more autobiographies I read, I love them. I enjoy them very much. I really do. But the more autobiographies I read, the more I realize, you know what? You got to take everything with a grain of salt. Try to confirm it. No matter what that person says, it is an opinion that person has, and they have values and they have biases that are going to come out. And how do you deal with that? Is there an agenda? Oh my goodness. Well, here's the thing. The answer to that is yes, because everybody has an agenda. Everybody is kind of coming from a perspective. It's not so much does the author have an agenda, but what is it? And how's that going to help you interpret it? Now, since the work was published, how has it been dealt with? Has it been looked upon more favorably or less favorably? Has part of it perhaps been debunked? Good things to know. So when you're reading autobiography, you want to look up some of these things and find out. Otherwise, I actually read one autobiography. I won't mention which one it was. And I got to the end of it and I really enjoyed it. It was fascinating. And then I found out that much of it just wasn't even true. Yeah, that's frustrating. That's kind of frustrating. All right. Bildungsroman. Oh, come on. Really, Bruce? What's up with the fancy? Okay, look, I don't speak German. I'm not trying to use fancy terms here. It's a commonly used term when talking about the Bildungsroman. It's just a German word that means a novel of education, but we usually use terms like a coming of age story. Okay, David Copperfield's kind of like, I've got Johnny Tremaine on here. Anytime you see a character who's fairly young, inexperienced, immature, and throughout the story, that person grows, that's a coming of age story. That's all it is. A story which chronicles someone's life. And it can be usually it is a fictional character. Sometimes it can just be a part of that person's life. Like the Odyssey, we see Odysseus' son, Telemachus, who is kind of growing into becoming a man, but not over the full 20 or so years, really just over a short period of time, from maybe late teens and early 20s. So there are different kinds, but it's just a coming of age story. Now, here's a huge one. Some novels that are categorized as a Bildungsroman, the author is actually writing something more like an autobiography. A great example of this would be James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, because Stephen Dedalus, that is James Joyce. Now, Stephen Dedalus is a fictional character, but I mean, good grief, their lives are basically exactly the same. Sometimes the author does it that way. Sometimes the person who's the protagonist is a totally different kind of individual. I think David Copperfield, again, I'll go back to that one. A lot of similarities with the life of Charles Dickens, the author. So good to know that, because that may or may not be the case. What is the definition of maturity? Now, if this author is saying, here's what it looks like when someone matures, you got to ask the question, well, am I buying that? Is that my definition of maturity? Is that a biblical definition of maturity? What are the catalyst events that sort of push the protagonist in the direction of maturity? Ooh, that's good to know. Fascinating, because what the author is saying, it probably is that, hey, reader, if those kinds of things happen in your life, then they might have the same impact, maybe. Why does the author believe that this person needs to grow? So how does the author define maturity, and how does the author define immaturity? Big one, big one. And then when you look at the character at the end of the story, is the author saying, now that is a full-grown, mature individual? Well, do you agree with that? Or is the author just saying, hey, look, the protagonist is only 14 at the end of the novel. I'm not saying it's all over, but maybe from 8 to 14, that's a Johnny Tremaine kind of thing. All right. One of my favorites, the dystopian novel. Love reading dystopian novels. I think 1984 is way up there on my list for favorites. Dystopia, a dystopian novel means a novel in which the world of the novel is a place where things have gone horribly wrong. So, for example, some sort of pandemic has wiped out almost everybody on planet Earth, and there are only 5 people left. That is a dystopian novel. Or a novel like 1984, where the people are ruled by evil of some kind. Okay, so dystopian novel means a novel in which the environment, the world in which everyone's living has gone terribly wrong. So what brought about the dystopia? Why is there a dystopia? What happened? Was there a nuclear war? Again, was it a disease or famine? What happened? Who is left? Who's living in it? And what are these people like? How do you get by day to day in that world? In the world of 1984, when you read about Winston Smith and Julia, they have to be very careful what they say, what they do, even what they think, because Big Brother is always watching. Are there elements of this future world in our world today? Now, frequently, as is the case with Orwell, the author is probably saying, hey, you think this is a scary world I'm describing? Well, wake up and smell the coffee, sister, because there are elements of this in our world today. Is that the case? Is the author trying to clue us into something? And Orwell is definitely saying to his readers, guys, authoritarian, totalitarian governments are bad. They're evil. They're wicked. Watch out for characteristics of them. He's shouting it in books like 1984. And how do we avoid this dystopia? So that's now epic. Ooh, this one's kind of deep. So an epic is a poem, first of all, but it's not just any poem. It's a longer poem that usually covers events. Sometimes epics are multi-generational. Sometimes they last for hundreds of years, and and you get lost in this world. That's kind of. But I came up with a little way to remember what an epic is. If you just remember the letters EPIC, an extremely long poem. It does have to be a poem. An epic is usually a poem. Okay. About an incredible hero. So there's one individual who is sort of highlighted. It's Achilles in the Iliad. It's Aeneas in the Aeneid. It's here on the board. It's Odysseus in the Odyssey. But what the author is doing is highlighting, using that individual to say, ooh, look at what this culture looks like. Greek culture here. With Virgil's Aeneid, it's Roman culture and so forth. Maybe Paradise Lost is pointing to a Christian culture. That's what an epic is. Okay. So questions that you would ask. First of all, try to figure out what kind of poetry it is. Dante's Inferno, Terza Rima, the Odyssey, dactylic hexameter. I know I'm not going to take time to explain what that is, but that's just the meter. So try to figure out what is the poetry, because knowing that's going to help students decipher what's going on. It's going to help them understand it a lot better. When they start asking questions like, why is this worded so oddly? And you say, well, let me explain. First of all, it's translated into English from Greek. And in the Greek, it had this format, this meter, this rhythm. And so that can kind of help some light bulbs come on with students to get over some of those hurdles of misunderstanding. The incredible hero. In an epic, am I supposed to be like Achilles, or am I not supposed to be like Achilles? What are the defining qualities of Christian in the Pilgrim's Progress, for example, or Odysseus in the Odyssey? Maybe it's an anti-hero. What is the culture that's being highlighted? Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and how do I assess that biblically, and am I supposed to emulate it? And is there an agenda? In the Aeneid, yeah, there's definitely an agenda. There's not as much of a controversial agenda in some epics. In other epics, there's a very, very controversial agenda. Got to know what that is going in. Moving right along, we come to the epistolary novel. Epistolary novel. What is that? What is that, Bruce? I don't even know what that is. Well, just think of the word epistle. It means letter or letters. And so an epistolary novel is just a novel that, instead of being written in a standard prose, narrative, maybe third person omniscient narrator format, it is comprised of letters written back and forth, usually between two individuals, but sometimes it can be one individual doing all the writing and the other person never responds, or you never hear that response. There's a literary reason for that. So, there's a lot of very well-known epistolary novels. Poor Folk, I have on the board here. Screw Tape Letters is an epistolary novel. You can think of, I'm blanking here, guys. Which one's that name? Poor Folk. Oh, Frankenstein. That's the one I had in my mind. I couldn't get it. Most people don't even realize, they know the story of Frankenstein, but they didn't remember that it's actually framed with this guy named Robert Walton, who's writing these letters to his sister back and forth. So anyway, sorry about the little brain freeze there. So again, from the get-go, try to figure out who is writing to whom. Is it a one-way communication or two-way? Why are they writing to each other? In Poor Folk, it's kind of an odd one because it's an older, middle-aged single guy who kind of sort of has this crush on this probably, 18 or 19-year-old girl. So it's weird in our culture. Wouldn't have been as odd in 19th century Russia, but good to know that. What is their relationship? Are they family members? Are they, you look at something like Gilead, for example, which you might have a father writing letters to a son. In that case, the father is very old, knows he's going to die soon, and he's writing letters to his young child, his son, and he knows that his son is not going to be reading those letters for a long time. Color Purple. Celia's writing letters to God and asking God, why do these horrible things happen to me? Do you not love me? Are you even there? So the epistolary format can be extremely powerful literary form. How much time elapses between letters? That's a good one. How about when you look at the scope of the whole novel? How much time goes by? A few weeks? A few years? Are they trying to keep it a secret? And if so, why? Are they open letters that everybody in the world can read? Are they truthful? See, that is when you come back to the what we call the unreliable narrator. When you're reading letters, is everything that every person has ever written in a letter true? Okay, no. The answer is no. The only letters that we know are absolutely true in every way would be the letters that are in the Bible. Other than that, they are people who are sinful and who have biases and who have agendas and opinions. And that's the fun part of reading and discussing literature. Gothic novel. Ooh, Gothic novel. Let's see. What is our example up here? I must have put this last. Oh, of course, it's going to be Frankenstein. A Gothic novel is a novel that is dark in some way or another. There's a darkness to it. The themes, perhaps, maybe it focuses more on death. Maybe it focuses more on the dark side of the human soul. And that is definitely the case with one of my all-time favorite Gothic novels, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. What's the theme of the novel? What is, and like, why did the author choose that? Like, they could have chosen, fiction, normal, generic fiction. They could have done a bildungsroman. Why did Mary Shelley choose Gothic? There are reasons for that. There are reasons. How does the author's use of the Gothic elements display man's sinful nature? Well, I don't care if the author is a Christian or non-Christian. By virtue of the genre itself, the Gothic form will display elements of man's sinful nature. This is one of the reasons I think it's a good thing for Christians to read Gothic novels that are well done. Is the author writing from a Christian perspective? Hugely important when you're getting involved in a genre like Gothic. And the worldview. How does that author's worldview impact the way they are dealing with those things? Mary Shelley was an atheist. So knowing that Mary Shelley was an atheist and that she's attacking issues like life and death and the meaning and purpose of existence, I mean, that's good to know. Good to know going in. You have your radar up, you're ready to look for certain things and dig in. Historical fiction. I got Killer Angels up here. Historical fiction is simply a story that the particular events in the story are not true in every way, but they are based on things that happened, truly happened in history. And of course, Killer Angels. I don't know if you've read Killer Angels, the Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. So now, first of all, I mean, guys, right off the bat, if you don't know what historical event is being featured in the novel, you're lost from, page one. Why would the author write about that event? Is it, say, Johnny Tremaine, Revolutionary War? Is it, say, American Civil War? Good to know that. But why? Why would the author deal with that? Was that a specialty of that author? Maybe that author had relatives that were involved, just good to find out. This is a huge one, and I go to the experts. I find one of my friends who's an expert in that time period, and I say, is this book accurate? That's what I do. And I did the very same with Killer Angels. Have a friend of mine who is a professor at the highest levels of education. He is an expert on this time period. And he has told me, yes, Bruce, this book is well done. It is very consistent with the event. When's the action novel occurring in relation? This is huge. Now, if the author is living 10 years after the events, wow, that's a different perspective. If the author is living 500 years after the events that are being portrayed in the novel, good to know. I mean, that author is going to have a very different understanding of those events. And once again, what's the agenda? Is there something going on? Like, this is a very common use of historical fiction. An author is living at a time, for example, when that author's government is either fighting a war or doing something that the author does not approve of. And the author says, I'm going to write a historical fiction novel about a war that happened a long time ago, but I'm kind of sort of going to bring in the same issues and controversies that are going on with our current situation, so people can look at my story and say, oh, wow, look at those parallels. Maybe we should or shouldn't be doing this. All right. Woo, we're making it through the alphabet. We're up to the P's now. Parody novel. A parody novel is a novel that is making fun of something, maybe in a harsh way, but it could just be in a light, funny, kind of haha, everybody's laughing kind of way. But a parody is when you take something that happened, an event or a person or a publication. In the case of Notes from Underground, it's a parody of a novel that was written the year before Dostoevsky wrote Notes from Underground, a book called What Is to Be Done by Nikolai Chernyshevsky. So it can be any of those things, but it's generally kind of sort of holding something up for ridicule to make your point. And obviously you're probably not exactly on board with that thing that you're ridiculing. I mean, Northanger Abbey is kind of a parody of Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, but I don't think that she's being mean or harsh in there. She's just kind of having some fun. So what is the author mocking? What's the event or the work and why? Like, why would that be an issue for that author? Does that author kind of have a little pet peeve about some part of it or some element of it? On a scale of 1 to 10, in terms of harshness, where would you put it? In Notes from Underground, I would put it higher. I would put it, I don't know, 6 or 7 or above. In Northanger Abbey, I would put that at, I don't know, maybe a 2. I think she's just having, again, I think she's just, I mean, she read Anne Radcliffe and she respected Anne Radcliffe. So she's not really trying to, slam her. Is the thing that's being mocked worthy of mockery? Yeah. Now, if it is a more severe kind of parody, then is that thing really so bad that this author is justified, you see that, in mocking it? Do you think the author crosses the line? Hey, you got to make these judgments. And teachers, we're trying to help our students think for themselves so that they can make these judgments as to whether or not they think the author, you know what, that was too far. That was unnecessary. That was, that's okay. When you look at Gulliver's Travels, I mean, is he just being a little bit, does Jonathan Swift come across as just being a little too grumpy? We kind of put that one in a satire category, but you understand what I mean. Does the author follow biblical principles of charity? Whoo! Now, if the author happened to be living at the same time as the thing that he or she is making a parody of, was it necessary for them to maybe practice a Matthew 18 kind of principle? Did you go and talk? Were there other ways, or did you just kind of throw this, how some people today just kind of put the grenade out there on social media? And, the person who gets hurt by that might be thinking, if you would have just come and talked to me, I feel like we probably could have talked this out. I don't know. Is there a situation like that? Maybe, maybe not. And if the author's making fun of something, then what does the author believe, the end result should be? Should the thing that he or she is mocking change or repent? Or do we all just kind of get together and have a big laugh about it? All right. Philosophical novel is a fictional story, but let me put everything up here. You might put Crime and Punishment in this category. You might put Thomas Mann's novel, the German writer, The Magic Mountain, or Dr. Faustus, again, Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov. There's a lot of, The Stranger, Camus here. What's the worldview that the author has? Oh, let me back up and just quick. I mean, I'm assuming you probably know what I mean, but it's just a story in which philosophical agendas and ideas are batted around, usually in dialogue, and the author is usually making some kind of philosophical point. Okay, so you got to find out, you got to help your students find out, what is that? What is I mean, guys, in this one, there is no question of, is there an agenda? By definition, there is an agenda with a philosophical novel. The question is, what is it? What's the context? When did the author, this goes back to the biographical tool in the literary toolbox. When, and the historical context, those are all going to tie in almost all of these, maybe all of these. Where have you seen these ideas throughout history, and how have they played out? And then finally, you want to assess it. And you would do this with all of them. Do you think that author did a good job of getting the message out there? Historical fiction, satire, parody, philosophical novel. That is a fun one to discuss with your students after you finish the novel. Hey, what's the I heard a teacher, one rhetoric teacher one time say, there really shouldn't be A, B, C, and D and F grades in rhetoric. Rhetoric is either pass or fail. Either you persuade the audience or you don't persuade the audience. How would you rate the author in a philosophical novel? Now, how about something that's just not a novel, but just pure philosophy? Critique of Pure Reason. I mean, I put How Should We Then Live up here, but I mean, good grief. It could be any number of Camus' philosophical essays, The Rebel, The Myth of Sisyphus. You've got to find out, teachers, when you're helping your students, what is where is the author on the essentials of biblical truth? Because that's the lens through which they're going to be, spouting off their philosophical assertions. And the epistemology is huge. How does the author believe we know? And I don't have time to explain that. I'm sorry, you'll have to look it up. Epistemology is just the study of knowing. How is it that we know things, that we learn things? Is it rationalism? Is it purely through the mind? Is it through the senses? That's empiricism. Got to know that. What are the presuppositions? Woo! Is it even possible to know truth? Truth is unknowable. Truth is only knowable if you're enlightened in some way. Okay, you may have some Buddhism or Hinduism in there. Got to know that. Oh, this is a huge one for this one, teachers. Do this at the beginning before you even teach the book. Get some terms out there that they have to know. And if they don't know these terms, they're going to be lost. You got to give them that right from the beginning. What's the overarching theme? Usually, even with a work of philosophy, there might be, shotgun ideas flying all over the place, but what's the big idea? Okay, what's the big idea? And how should we then live? Schaeffer is basically trying to tie in, how did we get to where we are today in light of what's happened? He starts with the Greeks and Romans, and he talks about how they dealt with truth. He talks a lot about epistemology, and he puts a whole lot of the blame for all of our woes on Thomas Aquinas. Now, a lot of folks disagree with that assessment. I do a little bit. But again, these are just things you got to figure out. Counter arguments. Try to figure, even if you agree or disagree with them, it doesn't matter. Even if it's an author you love, what are the counter arguments? How does the other side address what this author says? Oh, this one's huge. And I think, teachers, we're missing the boat a little bit on this one. Taking the time to say, okay, I love C.S. Lewis, but who impacted him? Good to know a little bit about people like George MacDonald, for example, and other, I do this with Flannery O'Connor, with Theodore Dostoevsky, with all my favorite authors. I want to find out what authors impacted them the most. That is going to help me. It's going to give me a really good filter for understanding their ideas a lot better. What am I supposed to do? What is to be done, Nikolai Chernyshevsky says. Now, I am going to go through this next part really quickly. I really did not intend for this video to be super long, and I can tell I think we're already past that. But how do you deal with poetry? Poetry is, a genre, but the difficulty here is there are so many different kinds of poetry. They're all very different, and you want to handle them differently. So I'm not going to go over questions here. I just want to throw out some forms of poetry that are probably going to be common forms. And you just want to give your student, guys, don't bury them with, here are the 45 most important things to know about Hebrew poetry. No, don't do that. Give them 3 things, give them 5 things, and just let them get started. Hebrew poetry, if you're not familiar with it, first of all, a ginormous chunk of the Bible is actually poetry. A lot of people don't realize that because it doesn't look like poetry. Isaiah doesn't look like poetry to a lot of students. So Proverbs doesn't. Psalms might be a little bit more obvious, but friends, this huge chunk of scripture, it's mostly all poetry. So that's the first thing you want to point out. And when we talk about Hebrew poetry, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about parallelisms. Again, I wish I had time to teach what they are, but a synonymous parallelism is just when the second line repeats the first. The second line is not saying something new. That is the genre of Hebrew poetry. It's just emphasizing the first idea. An antithetical parallelism, the second line is saying the opposite. So if you didn't understand the first line, then read the second line and then figure out what the opposite of that is, and that gives you the meaning of the first line. And friends, this is the entire book of Psalms. This is Proverbs. This is most of the prophets. Okay, the material there that's not history narrative, almost all of it. Song of Solomon is Hebrew poetry. Synthetic carries the idea forth or expands upon it instead of, being the same or the opposite. But in Hebrew poetry, what rhymes are not sounds, but thoughts. Brilliant that God saw fit to inspire the Old Testament in Hebrew, because when it's translated, otherwise it wouldn't rhyme. But even in translation, it's still poetic. That's beautiful, because it's the ideas that have this sort of rhyme to them, not the sounds. There's some examples. You can look those up. Second kind of poetry is epic poetry. I already told you what an epic is. Teach your students this little acronym, because then when they're reading it, they'll know what to look for. Oh, I need to know what kind is this dactylic hexameter. Oh, who's the hero? What's he like? There you go. Since I already did that one, I'm going to move on. I'm really talking about Dante here, but it's tell your students ahead of time, guys, this is very different than Homer. Terza rima is not the same as dactylic hexameter, but it is a beautiful and enjoyable rhyme scheme. And there it is, ABA. Then the middle sound at the end of the line becomes the first and the last of the next triplet, whatever you call it, tercet. You see that? It's a beautiful, read, even if you don't really know Italian, go and read some of Dante in his original, or get somebody who knows a little bit of a Romance language to read it for you. It's phenomenal. It's just beautiful. Teach your students what that is and to enjoy the aesthetic of the literature as well as the content. We don't do that as much as we should. We need to help students appreciate the aesthetic. What are we doing here at the Alyosha Society? Pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness. Not just truth and goodness, beauty. And that's what we talk about with poetry, is the aesthetic. Sonnets, when they're reading Shakespeare, teach them what a sonnet is. Teach them how each of the 14 lines has to have 10 syllables. That's an iambic pentameter. Talk to them about how hard it would be to construct a poem like that and still be a beautiful work of art. There you go. There is a typical sonnet, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. Anyway, know that, teach that. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. You know sonnet number 18. Maya Angelou, I put her picture up there. There could be a lot of, T.S. Eliot. I mean, anything probably from the 1920s or 30s on, last 100 years. Modern poetry, I'm sorry, friends, it's kind of a free-for-all. It probably has some kind of meter. It may be more difficult to discern what it is. But here's what you need to do when you teach modern poetry. Ask them why. Why is it that poetic forms in maybe the 17th or 16th or 18th century have this very rigid, strict format, and modern poetry doesn't? What are the philosophical reasons and implications of that? Ooh, good stuff. I think we're winding down here. Social contract, political philosophy. Political philosophy, maybe Communist Manifesto, there's a ton of these if you're a teacher that you're probably going to have to deal with. But what is the author's agenda? What is the ultimate authority according to the author? So why do they have any authority? Even if you're talking about Plato's Republic, why does that person have any authority to tell me how I should set up my government today? What does that person believe about the nature of man? That one is huge. Oh, friends, please go back to the Federalist Papers. And what did Madison say? If men were angels, we wouldn't need government. but men are not angels. Therefore, not only do we need a government, but we need to govern the government. That is because his worldview believed something very specific about a sinful nature of man. That's why Madison said those famous words in the Federalist paper. So, primary purpose of government, these are my questions for, and then I think this is my last one, satire. I've got Gulliver's Travels up here. Really very similar to parody, the questions. Why is the author making fun of this thing? Is it serious? Is it just goofy? What is the author saying should change? Is it effective? These are my satire. At this point, I assume, okay, Bruce, I kind of sort of feel like I'm getting the picture. So there you have it, friends. This is the Alyosha Society, where we're pursuing truth and beauty and goodness. And I hope this video on genre questions has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, or you have maybe want to add some to my list, I'd love for you to shoot me a note, Bruce at alyoshasociety.com.